Hello, hello, beautiful listeners. I'm really excited for today's topic. And if you are listening to this on the day it drops, happy winter solstice. Here we are in the Northern Hemisphere, sitting in the coldest and darkest moment of the year, knowing, trusting that brighter days, longer days are ahead, warmer days are ahead, and we're right at that intersection of things have been getting slower, colder, darker. And we know we're moving into something that looks different, but we're in it. We're in the deep winter. So here's what we're going to do in today's episode on wintering. We're going to start by creating a set of distinctions, talking about what is this thing called wintering. And then I'm going to walk you through what's powerful about it. What is the power source? Literally, where can you call in strength from wintering? And even just notice like what are the associations that you have when you hear winter, wintering, cold, dark? Like what's your relationship with those concepts, those ideas? And then what we're going to do is talk about like what's the power in that. Specifically, we're going to look at the power of dark, the power of cold, the power of letting go, and the power of rest. So those are going to be the four ways I think of dark and cold as realities of winter, letting go and rest as practices that wintering invites us to. So we'll talk about that. And then we'll close, as one does, with some reflection questions, things that you can consider as you think about how you want to integrate the lessons of today into your life, which is my wish. Now, why am I offering you these set of distinctions? As a coach of leaders and teams, as a deeply curious human being moving through this world, I recognize that we have a choice. We can let life knock us about, or we can choose our path. And this becomes harder when we are knocked off, when we are met with circumstances that we perhaps didn't expect, certainly that we didn't wish for, that are hard. And so learning how to build our resilience around fallow periods, around times of winter, really sets us up to be able to adapt when those times show up, which they will. Even in the face of that, we can set a vision, lead with intention, act on purpose. We can design ourselves. And I think that's a road worth choosing. So, what is wintering? I'm going to read here. I'm going to pull my book here off the table. I'm going to read to you from a passage of Katherine May's book, Wintering, which fittingly came out in 2020. And if it came out in 2020, it was in the works well before that time. The subtitle is The Power of Rest and Retreat in Difficult Times. So you can imagine that dropping in 2020 and just how fitting it was. You probably have heard of this book. It's okay if you haven't, but it got a lot of deserved acclaim, particularly in the moment it came out. So here's how she describes wintering. Wintering is a season in the cold. It is a fallow period in life when you're cut off from the world, feeling rejected, sidelined, blocked from progress, or cast into the role of an outsider. Perhaps it results from an illness or a life event, such as a bereavement of the birth of a child. Excuse me. Oh, gosh. Let me try that again. Such as a bereavement or the birth of a child. They could happen together. She writes about them separately. Perhaps it comes from a humiliation or failure. Wintering is a season in the cold. It is a fallow period in life when you're cut off from the world. Feeling rejected, sidelined, blocked from progress, or cast into the role of an outsider. Perhaps it is the result from an illness or a life event, such as a bereavement or the birth of a child. Perhaps it comes from a humiliation or failure. Perhaps you're in a period of transition and have temporarily fallen between two worlds. Some winterings creep upon us more slowly, accompanying the protracted death of a relationship, the gradual ratcheting up of caring responsibilities as our parents age, the drip, drip, drip of lost confidence. Some are appallingly sudden, like discovering one day that your skills are considered obsolete. The company you worked for has gone bankrupt, or your partner is in love with someone new. However it arrives, wintering is usually involuntary, lonely, and deeply painful. She goes on to say, yet it is also inevitable. So back to its most basic definition that Katherine May gives us, wintering is a season in the cold, a fallow period when you're cut off from the world, a season in the cold. I had a few ways that wintering showed up in my own consciousness of how I thought about it. First, it showed up as an appreciation for seasonal living, which was something I was beginning to become mindful of before I moved out of my native Washington, D.C. to a dirt road in the Catskills in upstate New York, where seasonal living is very present. Will I be able to drive off the dirt road based on what the season is? What's the quality of mud like? What's the quality of ice like? But even before I moved here, I was aware of seasonal food. What's at the farmer's market? And again, this is just a waking up to how do we think about the seasons? And I noticed in myself that as I became aware of seasons, winter was the last season that I felt called to pay attention to. Interestingly, I'm a winter baby. I was born in early January. Um, and and yet I thought, let's just like move through this. Let's get to those warmer months. And that is, I think that's common for many of us, certainly in the way that much of our work culture exists, our educational cultures exist. It's about planting seeds, seeing what emerges, letting things grow, harvesting, and then rinse, repeat. Let's go back, planting those seeds again, letting things emerge and grow, and then harvesting them. And it becomes an increasing desire to do that as fast as possible. And so to come to an understanding that winter as a season, is critical to be able to grow things sustainably. We have to let the ground rest. We have to let human beings rest. We have to let our work rest. We'll have to let our clients rest. We have to let our teams rest, right? We have to allow this dark, quiet, still, restful period to be able to let the next thing emerge and do so in a way that is healthy and sustainable, that allows us to build resilience, an ability to come back again and again to do this. That's the cycle. So I came into this idea of seasonal living and then an appreciation for winter. And then came in, and this was before Katherine May's book, before COVID times. Then I came into the distinction of wintering. And at that point, I thought of it as an act. Like winter is the noun, wintering is the verb, inviting us to embody the characteristics of winter. And for those of you who've been with the podcast for a long time, you've heard me talk about things like letting go and saying no and finding quiet, embracing stillness, right? This is wintering, to be able to do these things, to practice these things. And to understand that we can show up differently, that we don't always have to be in the productivity. And because I like productivity too, and to know that our productivity, the quality of what we produce, even the volume of what we produce is better. We yield better results by letting things rest, by wintering. And then I came into Katherine May's book and the distinctions that she put forth. And I highly recommend this book if you can't tell. um, what I really appreciated about her framing was that understanding that wintering also happens in unexpected times, that it's not just in the cycle, that our personal winterings don't always happen aligned with the seasons. The season of winter is not the only time that we lose someone that we love. It's not the only time that we lose a job or an important relationship. It's not the only time where we experience a death of expectations. We thought it was going to be one way and it was another way. We thought we were going to be one way and we were another way. We are another way. And that distinction for me of seeing, oh, wintering is something that also happens very personally. It was very helpful. And it was really helpful to experience at a time where so many of us were having a collective winter, 2020, height of the pandemic unleashing itself on the world. And still there were personal winters in that. But even to see like, oh, right, that this is something we're all seeing. So I wanted to invite that set of distinctions in for you so you can think about, yeah, it's okay to winter. Wintering is normal, and learning how to be in the practice of how we winter is incredibly powerful. So I'm going to talk about what's powerful about it. Let's start with the power of the dark. And I'm going to share in each of these moments of what's powerful about it, like something that shifted for me. And the thing that shifted for me around the power of dark happened when I was pregnant. And I've had 3 pregnancies. I have 3 children, very fortunate that way. And I remember talking with a midwife in the practice I was a part of in Washington, D.C. And I remember saying to her, like I'm up a lot in the middle of the night. And take me out of pregnancy, I'm also up a lot in the middle of the night all the time. Like this is not specific uh to when I'm pregnant. And what she said to me, and it has helped me so much in the whole of my life, was that the wise women of the world are awake in the dark. And I thought, oh, because I'm thinking, how do I solve this problem of being up when it's dark? And her point was that when women are pregnant, when they're going through menopause, when they're on their menstrual cycles and hormones are changing, it's a natural occurrence that we are called to be awake in times when many others are sleeping in the dark. And that distinction was really working for me. I am now paying vastly more attention in the last couple of years too, but how also do I get better at sleeping? But just understanding that it's okay to be moving when it's dark, and that to notice that the world feels different in the dark. When was the last time you walked outside and sat in the dark? No lights on, no distractions. What's that quality of sound? What's that quality of sight? How do we adapt? We do adapt. We see differently the longer we sit in the darkness. Our bodies adapt to it. And so for me, the power of the dark is quiet and also bravery. I definitely grew up afraid of the dark. I am not embarrassed to admit that I would, like, if I watched a scary movie, I could have been in college. I was sleeping with the lights on. Like I was afraid of what might show up in the dark. Now I take time most days to get out into the darkness, particularly due to aforementioned being up when most other people are sleeping, not because I went to bed because I'm up and everyone else has gone to bed, but because I've risen earlier. And I just like to get out and sit in it, and because I do live in a rural location where I can get up and look up at the stars, or notice that there's a different kind of cloud cover and I can't see the stars, or notice that the stars look crisper because of um, the cold. And what is that about? I don't know. I'm curious, but it's powerful to be up in the dark. Let's talk about the power of cold. So, when I had originally put wintering on my editorial calendar, I didn't know that I would have started this new practice, but I have, called cold plunging, where for me, what that looks like is um, I I live close to many very cold bodies of water here in December, and so I'm getting into up to my shoulders, sometimes just up to my waist, depending on how I feel, but usually up to my shoulders, thinking about putting my whole head in, feeling like I could be ready for that. But where I'm putting myself in cold water and there's ice at the water's edge. I'm doing this with others, sometimes on my own. Have paid attention to what is safe, what is not safe, and also noticing that there's a lot of just like putting myself in cold waters that like the instinct is run, this is not safe. But there's a whole set of distinctions. Look up Wim Hof, look up look up cold plunging. I'll link to a couple articles in the show notes. Um, but just the power of immersing yourself in cold. I noticed for myself, again, like what's different. I've spent a lot of my life running from the cold. I have a condition called Raynaud's. So that showed up when I was probably around 15, where I noticed that the tip of one of my fingers was white, like no color in it, kind of like a yellowy white. And turns out that's because there's no blood in it. And that can happen to me now if I'm in a supermarket in the summer and I get something out of the freezer, or even just because supermarkets are crazily air conditioned, like so much cold, sometimes even just by walking through a supermarket. And so, how do I not have that happen where I lose? And it can happen for me, it's worse in my hands. It can also happen in my feet and my toes, where you could see like I will have no color in any of my digits. It's all yellow, no blood. And then it's like, I got to get it warm. And if I don't ever get it that cold, it won't happen. So, thus, like the impulse is run from the cold. Well, what I've experienced in cold plunging, where for me right now, I'm usually going in for around a minute, so putting, you know, putting myself in cold water up to my shoulders for, like the last 2 weeks, I've been doing it most every day. And what I'm finding is that there is a clarity of thought and also like a buzziness in my body. And in my heart, it's like I did something scary. And in the beginning, I remember the first time I went in up to my shoulders. Thank you, dear friend Cassidy, who took me in. Um, when I went up to my shoulders, I remember looking at her and saying, like, I got to tell you, like, my head is freaking out right now. Like, anxiety's on the table. And there's a chapter in Katherine May's book, by the way, on um, cold waters. Check that out too if you if you want to read more. But I remember looking at her and saying, "My head's freaking out." And she's like, "Do you want to get out?" And I'm like, I probably said nothing because I couldn't get words out, but I was in my head at least, I was like, "Wait, breathe, sit with it." And then she asked me again, and I was like, "Yeah, I'm ready to get out." And I was so grateful to have someone who I could say, like, "Can you hold my hand as I get out?" Like I feel both emotion, probably even more so emotionally and also physically, but just scared, like, like, help me back out. And she did. Now I'm every day holding this intention to get in the water and I'm like ready for it. It's different every day. Point is, I used to run from the cold. Now I'm calling it in. And that's kind of my mantra when I'm doing the cold plunging. I'm like, invite the cold in. Let it contract my muscles, let it let it um, let me appreciate that when I get out, the warmth comes back. Like, cool. And so every time I do it, I'm learning something new. I'm calling in the cold. So cold, dark realities of our winters. There are also practices. So we can fill, and this again from my urban life, and there are certainly characteristics of this that still show up today. But if I look back to my urban life, Washington, D.C., adult life, it's like all the activities, all the events, all the going out to eat, all that, like I could fill my time. And in fact, I felt called to. And there are times of my seasons of life where like I want the summer. I want to go and be out and do. And I was living that way all the time. So the practices of letting go and rest have become really important to me. On the power of letting go, it's amazing to see what opens up to us when we carve out space. But if we fill the space, there's no room. And so to just release things and not know what's going to come in is an act of trust, is even an act of defiance. Like, I'm going to just hold this space and then see. And that's incredible. Like, whew. But we have to learn how to let go in order to do that. And I always think back to the distinction that was created to me when I went through Georgetown's leadership coaching program, that intellectual learning is an additive process, is adding in versus letting go. I'm adding in a new skill. I'm adding in a new job. I'm adding in a new practice, right? It's intellectual. And I feel quite accomplished. I was a good student. I was a frequently promoted employee. I know how to add things in. Letting go is not about the intellect. It's not about the head. It's about the heart. It's about the emotions. Letting go requires emotional learning, cozying up to fear, getting comfortable in sadness, in grief, getting comfortable in anger, and in happiness, and in joy, and in excitement. Letting go requires us to release. And when we can, we carve out the space for what's more. And that's amazing. Power of letting go. Power of rest. It's so easy to see when we look at our agricultural systems. The ground needs rest to produce in a sustainable way. When we have plenty of agricultural practices that are challenging our earth. That's somebody else's podcast, but it is something I'm deeply curious about and interested in. We too, our bodies, our hearts, our minds, our teams, our clients need rest to produce in a sustainable way. And we can think about this on micro levels when we stop trying to do the thing and get it done and finish it off. Like the new idea emerges. And I can think to myself, it was a very specific treadmill run I was on because it was when I was recovering from a certain period of wintering in my life after I had a very wild staph infection after the birth of my second child. And I wasn't able to walk for a period of time. And so I was in the process of rebuilding strength to be able to walk. And so this treadmill was freaking so cool. It was an anti-gravity treadmill. So I could put myself in it I would step into this kind of suit up to my waist, and then it would get zipped in, tied to the treadmill, so that from the waist down, air could blow into this suit and literally lighten my weight so that I had less weight going down when I was running on the treadmill. So part of building back strength. Anyway, I remember very specifically being on this run and having a new idea for how I could return to work. And it was just like after having been like soul and body crushingly incapacitated at a time where I felt I should be so great at what I'm able to give. I am newly a mother again. I also have a 2-year-old. Like, why can't I do this? Like, that was definitely a grieving period that I was in. And yet, it was through the act of um, stepping out of the effort to try and do all of those things and taking care of myself. And it was a form of rest for me to be on a treadmill. I can see how that might be counterintuitive for some. But to get to that 15 minutes of doing that treadmill, I had to take a half day or more of my life to travel to the place where the anti-gravity machine existed, to wait in line, to get on it, to do those 15 minutes, and then here comes the ideas. And I remember, like, my view was of a parking lot. It was very uninspiring. I'm in a corner of this room. The space itself was not particularly inspirational, but just having the rest of, like, taking that time to do it, like, here comes the ideas. That's what happens when we rest. New things can emerge, new things can grow. Are there times to push forward and produce? Absolutely, but not all the time. We've got to rest too. All right. Some closing reflection questions for you. And these will be over at the show notes. You can, on most of the podcasting apps, you can link to that straight from where you are. If you don't see it, go to pointroadstudios.com. You'll be able to navigate to this podcast episode from there. Here's what I want you to consider. And right now, just let these questions wash over you. Let's start by honoring your experience with wintering. What periods of wintering have you experienced? Where have you been in a fallow period, cut off from the world? And what do you notice about how you showed up during those times? Maybe pick one or two of three or three of them. Maybe you're paying attention to habits, patterns, emotions, actions, supports. What do you notice about how you showed up during those periods of wintering in your life? And then I want to, there's a question that I remember back in my days at the advisory board company that I remember being taught to ask this question and it feeling very scripted and not really in my own voice. But it's a good one, which is what keeps you up at night? And kind of holding the spirit of winter as we've talked about it. Maybe a more in my own voice version of this question would be, what weighs on you in the dark and cold? What keeps you up at night? What weighs on you in the dark and cold? And then just notice too, what is your relationship to winter? I was inviting some of that perspective in at the top of today's episode. What about your relationship to wintering? You might think about, do I crave the hibernation period? A moment to let go and reassess? Or is my instinct to run from it, to plant new seeds, to restart the growth process, to keep that going? Just notice, what's your relationship to winter, to wintering? And then finally, as we are here, as this podcast drops on the very first day of winter, officially, what do you hope to learn this winter? And what will support you on that path? Those are the questions I want you to sit with. And if you feel like, oh, I want to share an answer to one of these with Sharon, come on. Hit me up at pointroadstudios.com. Find me on LinkedIn, Instagram. I would love to hear from you. And know that it is my wish for you that you may be unburdened by the dark and the cold of wintering. And more than that, that you can learn to embrace it, to call in the dark and the cold. Don't run from it. It is through learning how to sit in this discomfort that we rebuild our resilience for when the unexpected winters arrive. And that, dear listeners, is what I wanted to show with you today. Please know that I am going to be here cheering for you and holding my own deeply held belief that there is nothing stopping you. So go on ahead and get after whatever it is that you really want.